The turkey had been in the oven since 5 in the morning. I remember checking the temperature twice before the sun came up, standing in my kitchen in my housecoat, watching the snow come down outside the window over the sink. It was the same window Tom and I had argued about when we first built this house. He wanted it smaller. I wanted to see the whole backyard while I cooked. I won that argument. I won a lot of arguments back then because Tom loved me enough to let me. That was 31 years ago. The kitchen still smelled the same on Christmas morning. Cinnamon from the apple pie cooling on the counter. The particular warmth of a gas oven working hard. The cedar garland I'd hung over the doorway every December since 1994, the one with the little brass bells that jingled when anyone walked through. My daughter-in-law had suggested, twice, that it looked a bit dated. I'd smiled and left it exactly where it was. I'm Dorothy Vaillancourt. I'm 63 years old. I live in Guelph, Ontario, and the house I'm standing in was built by my husband's hands and paid for by 30 years of our combined work. Tom was a civil engineer. I was a high school English teacher for 28 years. We weren't wealthy, but we were careful, and this house, 4 bedrooms, a proper front porch, a backyard big enough for a vegetable garden, was the physical proof of everything we'd built together. Tom died 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I won't spend much time on that part because some grief doesn't need to be performed for anyone, but I will say this. When he died, I made a decision. I was 59 years old. I was not going to disappear. I was going to stay in this house, tend the garden he and I had planted together, teach my last few years until retirement, and then figure out what came next. I was doing exactly that when my son Matthew called me from Calgary. Matthew is 34. He has his father's build and his father's stubbornness, and for the first years after Tom died, he called every Sunday without fail. He'd moved to Calgary for work 8 years earlier, something in energy consulting that I've never fully understood, and he'd met Renee out there. They married when Matthew was 30, a small wedding in Banff that I flew out for and genuinely enjoyed. Renee was sharp and funny, and she seemed to love my son in a way that made me feel like I could breathe easy about him. For a while, things were fine. The cracks started small, the way they always do. A comment here, a look there. The kind of thing you tell yourself you're imagining because the alternative that you're not imagining it is too uncomfortable to sit with. The first comment I remember was at Easter, 2 years ago. I'd made my mother's tourtière, the same recipe I'd been making since I was 17 years old, pork and potato and a particular blend of spices that took me years to get right. Renee looked at it on the table and said, "Oh, is this what we're having?" Not unkindly, exactly, but not kindly either. Matthew didn't say anything. I told myself she was probably just surprised. Then there was the visit in September, when they came for a long weekend, and Renee spent most of Saturday going through my living room with a particular expression on her face, the kind of expression people make in antique shops when they're trying to figure out if something is charmingly vintage or just old. She'd picked up the framed photo of Tom and me on our honeymoon in Charlottetown and set it back down without saying anything. She'd run her hand along the back of Tom's armchair, the green one, the one I'd had reupholstered twice because I couldn't bring myself to replace it, and said, "Have you ever thought about redecorating?" I said, "No." She said, "You could really open up the space." I said, "I like it how it is." She smiled and moved on, and I told myself that was the end of it. It wasn't. The phone call came on a Tuesday in February. Matthew's voice was different, careful, pre-arranged, the way it sounds when he's about to ask for something he's already decided he needs. He and Renee were having some difficulties. The consulting firm had restructured. He'd been moved to a different division, lower billing rate, things were tight. They'd been renting in Calgary, but the landlord was selling the building, and they needed to find somewhere by April 1st. Could they stay with me for a few months, just until they sorted themselves out, maybe 4 months, 5 at the outside? My son's voice. The same voice that used to call for me at night when he had bad dreams, the same voice that read his valedictory speech at graduation while I sat in the 3rd row and cried into a tissue. How could I say no? I said yes. I told him the guest room was his. I told him I'd clear out Tom's old office so Renee could have a proper space to work from home. She did something with social media management, brand consulting. I was never entirely clear. I said we'd make it work. They arrived on April 9th with a rented cargo van and 3 carloads of boxes. I want to be precise about what happened next because I've thought about it a great deal in the time since, and I think precision matters. It didn't happen all at once. If it had happened all at once, I would have recognized it immediately. Instead, it happened the way water shapes stone slowly, persistently, without any single moment you could point to and say, there. That was when it changed. The first thing was the coffee maker. Mine was a simple drip machine, 12 years old, perfectly functional. 2 weeks after they arrived, I came downstairs one morning to find a large chrome espresso machine on the counter where mine used to be. My coffee maker was on the floor beside the recycling bin with a Post-it note on it that said for donation. I stood there in my housecoat holding that Post-it note. When Renee came downstairs, I showed it to her and asked where my machine had gone. She said the new one made better coffee and she'd assumed I'd prefer it. She showed me how to use it. The milk frother alone had 7 settings. I smiled. I said thank you. I used it for 3 weeks before I went to Canadian Tire and bought myself a new drip machine and put it on the other end of the counter. Renee didn't say anything about that, but she looked at it the way she'd looked at Tom's armchair. Then there was the matter of the garden. Tom and I had planted that backyard garden in 2003. Raised beds along the back fence, a perennial border down the east side, a section of native plants near the shed that we'd put in specifically to support pollinators. The rhubarb in the corner had been there since we moved in and was older than Mathieu. I had spent 20 years learning what that soil needed. I knew which corner drained poorly in spring. I knew which spot got the right afternoon light for the tomatoes. In May, Renee decided she wanted to redesign the garden. She didn't ask me. She mentioned it to Mathieu and he mentioned it to me as if it were a kind gesture. Renee wants to do a whole thing with the backyard. She's really into it. She thinks she can make it beautiful. I said the backyard was already beautiful. He said she meant a different kind of beautiful. I said I wasn't interested in a different kind. But I went to work the next Monday, and when I came home, I was still doing part-time tutoring that spring. 2 of the raised beds had been moved, and the native plant section had been partially dug up. Renee was outside in gardening gloves, looking pleased with herself. She said she'd kept all the plants, just reorganized the layout. Didn't it look more open? I looked at the soil where the echinacea and the wild bergamot had been. I looked at the rhubarb, which had mercifully been left alone. I looked at the native plant section, dug up and sitting in plastic nursery pots, some of them already wilting. Those plants need to go back in the ground today, I said. They won't survive in pots. She said she was planning to replant them somewhere better. I said, they have been in that spot for 15 years. It is their spot. She looked at me with an expression I would come to know well over the following months. Patient, faintly amused. The expression of someone who has already decided they know better and is waiting for you to figure that out. I replanted every one of those plants myself that evening. My knees were aching by the time I finished. Mathieu brought me a glass of water and sat beside me on the garden border and said he was sorry. He thought she'd asked me first. He seemed genuinely surprised that she hadn't. I believe he was telling the truth. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't lived it. Renee wasn't cartoonishly villainous. She was strategic in ways that were quiet and deniable, and my son was not a bad person, just a person who had learned to minimize friction by looking away. By June, certain things in the house had simply migrated. The framed cross-stitch my mother had made it used to hang in the front hallway. It said, "Home is where the heart is," in that corny way I loved, was in the basement. When I asked about it, Renee said it had seemed like it might get damaged in a high-traffic area. The throw blankets Tom and I had bought in Lunenburg on our 25th anniversary were in a bin. The hall table, where I kept my keys and mail, and a small ceramic bowl my daughter, I should mention, I also have a daughter, Sylvie, who is 31 and lives in Ottawa and is wonderful, had made for me in a pottery class, that table was gone entirely. In its place was a sleek console table that Renee had ordered online. I found my ceramic bowl wrapped in newspaper in a kitchen drawer. I sat down at my kitchen table, my kitchen, my table, my house, and I was very quiet for a long time. I want to tell you what that silence felt like, because I think it matters. It wasn't the silence of not knowing what to do. It was the silence of someone who has been warm and generous for so long that they've stopped recognizing when the warmth is being taken as permission. I had been so afraid of being the difficult mother-in-law, the overbearing presence, the woman who made her son's marriage hard, that I had confused kindness with surrender. I had been so determined not to be a burden that I'd allowed something worse to happen. I had been treated like a guest in my own home, and I had smiled and made it easier for everyone involved. I am an English teacher. I have read enough stories to know that there is always a moment, a specific, crystalline moment, where the character either sees clearly or chooses not to. I sat at my kitchen table that June evening and I saw clearly. I did not say anything that night. I thought it was important to be certain before I moved, so I watched. I paid attention. I kept a small notebook in my cardigan pocket, a habit from years of classroom observation, and I wrote down what I noticed. I noticed that Renee never asked, she informed. She would say, "I'm having some people over Friday evening," the way you'd say it to a roommate, rather than to the person whose home you were living in. I noticed that certain spaces in the house had been subtly claimed. The good armchair in the living room was now always occupied by her things, her laptop, her charging cables, her water bottle, a kind of soft territorial marking. I noticed that when her friends came over, she would give them a tour as though she were the host, and I was never mentioned. I noticed that Matthew would look at me across the room sometimes with an expression that was part apology, part helplessness, part something I recognized from when he was a child and had broken something and was hoping I wouldn't notice. I noticed that he hadn't backed me up once, not in 4 months, not over the coffee maker or the garden or the hall table or anything else. 4 months became 5. 5 became 6. When I asked Matthew about their plans in early October, he said things were taking longer than expected. The job situation was still complicated. He said it as though this were simply a fact about the weather. I said, "Matthew, I need a timeline." He said, "Mom, we're trying." I said, "I understand you're trying. I would like a date." He said he'd talk to Renee. He said it the way you say it when talking to Renee is the thing that prevents you from doing anything. The Christmas invitation was the last thing. I began my preparations in November, the way I always had. I wrote out my grocery list in the proper order. Tom had teased me about this for 30 years, the list organized by section of the store, and I started thinking about the menu. Turkey, obviously. My grandmother's cranberry sauce. Brussels sprouts with pancetta. Roasted root vegetables from the garden, some of which I'd managed to save despite the spring's interference. Apple pie. My mother's tourtière, because it wasn't Christmas without it. I'd also spoken to Sylvie. She and her partner Gabriel were driving up from Ottawa on the 24th. I was looking forward to it more than I could properly say. Having Sylvie in the house again, having the whole family together, or at least the version of together that had been possible since Tom died, felt important. It felt like returning to something. I mentioned this to Matthew at dinner one evening in late November. I said Sylvie and Gabriel would be here on the 24th. We'd do Christmas Eve together, Christmas Day, the big meal. Renee looked up from her phone. "Oh," she said, "I actually invited some people for Christmas Day." I put down my fork. "I'm sorry?" "My friend Caitlin from Calgary is coming to visit, and I told her she could come for Christmas dinner, her boyfriend too. And my cousin Jade is in Toronto now, so I invited her and her husband. For Christmas dinner," I said. "Here." "They don't have anywhere else to go," Renee said. She said it as though this settled the matter. I looked at Matthew. Matthew looked at his plate. "Renee," I said, and I was very careful with my voice, "this is my home. Christmas dinner in this house is something I planned for my family. You should have spoken to me before inviting anyone." She looked at me with that patient expression and said, "I thought you'd be fine with it. It's just a few more people." "It is not about a few more people. It is about the fact that this is my house, and you invited guests to my house without asking me. You're making this into a bigger deal than it is." "I don't believe I am," Matthew said quietly. "Maybe we can just—" "Matthew," I said, "I would like to hear your thoughts on this." He was silent for 5 full seconds. I counted. Then he said that Renee probably should have mentioned it first, but maybe there was a way to make it work. I stood up from the table. I took my plate to the kitchen. I washed it, dried it, put it away. I went upstairs and I called Sylvie. I told her everything. Not just the Christmas dinner, everything. The coffee maker and the garden and the hall table and the ceramic bowl and 7 months of watching my home become unrecognizable to me. Sylvie was very quiet on the phone. She is quiet in the way that means she is thinking. Then she said, "Mum, why didn't you tell me sooner?" I didn't have a good answer for that. She said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want my house back." She said, "Then let's figure out how." What I did next, I did carefully, because I am a careful person, and because I understood that if I acted from pure anger, I would lose whatever ground I had. I spoke to a lawyer, a woman I'd known peripherally for years, whose daughter had been one of my students, and she confirmed what I had already suspected. My home, my rules, my legal right to determine who lived there and under what conditions. I was not a villain for wanting those rights respected. I also spoke to my friend Paulette, who had been through something similar with her own son and his partner a decade earlier. Paulette said, "Dorothy, the moment you started apologizing for existing in your own home was the moment this became possible. You need to stop apologizing." I had not realized I'd been apologizing, but when I thought about it, I had been constantly, preemptively, apologetically existing in spaces that were mine, making myself smaller so there was room for everyone else's comfort. I wrote a letter. I'm an English teacher. Letters are my medium. I wrote it over 3 evenings, revising each time until it was exactly right. It was not a cruel letter. It was not a dramatic letter. It stated simply and clearly that I needed Matthew and Renee to move out by February 15th. It stated that this decision was not open to negotiation. It stated that I loved my son and I looked forward to a relationship with him that was not complicated by a living arrangement that was no longer working. I said that I would do everything I could to make the transition easier for them. I had already looked up rental listings in Guelph and in Hamilton and had printed out 15 options in various price ranges. I also addressed the Christmas dinner. I wrote that Renee's guests were not welcome on Christmas Day. I wrote that I wished her friends no personal ill, and I understood they were in a difficult position through no fault of their own, but that Christmas in my home was a family occasion, and that I had neither been consulted nor had I agreed. I said that if Matthew and Renee wished to host their own celebration for their friends, I would be happy to arrange a different date in January at which the house would be theirs for the evening. I slid the letter under their bedroom door on a Wednesday morning before Matthew left for his remote work calls. I went downstairs and made myself a pot of coffee, the drip machine, the good one, and I sat at my kitchen table and looked out at the December backyard, the garden dormant under the first snowfall, the rhubarb cut back to the ground and waiting, the way rhubarb does, for spring. Matthew came downstairs at 9:30 with the letter in his hand. He sat across from me. He looked older than 34 right then. He looked like a man who had been caught between 2 things for a long time and had been hoping nobody would make him choose. "Mum," he said. "I love you," I said. "This is not about love." "I know. Do you?" He was quiet. Outside, a cardinal landed on the back fence, brilliant red against the snow, and then was gone. "She's not a bad person," he said. "I haven't said she was. This situation got away from us." "It did," I agreed. These things usually do, when no one is paying attention to the small things. February 15th is soon. It is 11 weeks away. That is enough time. He looked at the letter again. He nodded once, slowly, the way Tom used to nod when he'd processed something difficult and arrived on the other side of it. "I'll talk to her," he said. "Thank you." "Christmas. Christmas is for me and Sylvie and Gabriel," I said. "That has not changed. I would be very glad to have you there as well. The decision is yours." Matthew spent an hour upstairs with Renee. I could hear the low oscillation of voices but not the words. When he came back down, he looked tired. He said Renee was upset. I said I understood. He said she felt like this was unfair. I took a breath and I said, very gently, that I was not in a position to negotiate what was fair in my own home. He nodded again. He poured himself a coffee. He sat with me at the table for a while, not saying much, and I was reminded of all the mornings when he was small and would come and sit with me before school, just existing in the same space, the particular comfort of that. I reached over and put my hand on his briefly. He turned his hand over and held mine. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said. "I should have seen what was happening." "You love her," I said. "It's not always easy to see clearly when you love someone. She's not always like this." "I believe you." And I did believe him. That is the complicated truth that I want to put down clearly, because I think it matters. Renee was not a monster. She was a person with certain habits of assumption, a habit of taking up space, of reading permission into silence, of mistaking generosity for agreement. Those habits had gone unchecked for long enough that she'd stopped noticing them. That does not make the harm any less real. But it means the story isn't simple, and I've never been interested in simple stories. Renee did not speak to me for 4 days. On the 5th day, she came downstairs while I was making lunch and stood in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing her hair down, which she rarely did, and she looked younger and somehow less certain than I'd seen her. "I owe you an apology," she said. I turned to face her. "I didn't think of this as your home," she said. "I mean, I knew it was your home, but I didn't think of it that way. I thought of it as—" She trailed off, looking for the word. "A space," I offered. She winced slightly. "Yes, I know that's not okay." I said, "Sit down." She sat. I made 2 cups of tea and brought them to the table, and we sat across from each other, and I said what I had been thinking about for weeks, which was this: that the problem with staying somewhere temporarily is that temporary can quietly become permanent if no one is honest about the conditions. That generosity is not the same as permission. That a person can welcome you into their home and still own that home, still have feelings about it, still need it to be the space that holds their life. I said that I didn't need her to love my decor or my coffee machine or the way I organized the garden, but I needed her to understand that these things were not hers to change. She listened. She cried a little, which I hadn't expected. She said she thought she'd been trying to make it feel more like home for herself and hadn't stopped to think about what it already was for me. I said, "I know." I said, "That's why these things need to be talked about, at the beginning, clearly." She nodded. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She looked, in that moment, like someone who had been allowed to understand something important and wasn't quite sure what to do with it yet. We were not going to be best friends. We both knew that, but something shifted in those 20 minutes that I think was necessary, and I don't regret having the conversation. They began making proper plans in December. Matthew found a position with a firm in Waterloo, a genuine step forward, not a lateral move, and they signed a lease on an apartment in Kitchener. The apartment was small, but it was theirs, a thing that is worth more than people give it credit for. On Christmas Eve, Sylvie and Gabriel arrived just after 4 in the afternoon, stomping the snow off their boots in my front hallway, the cedar garland above them swaying with the rush of cold air, the little brass bells jingling. I hugged my daughter for a long time. Matthew was there too. He had chosen to be, which meant more than I could easily say. He sat next to Sylvie on the couch after dinner, and they talked until 11, the easy conversation of siblings who have known each other their whole lives, and I sat across from them with my tea and watched, and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't fully realized had been tight. Renee had gone to stay with her cousin in Toronto for the holiday. I wished her well with my whole heart. Christmas morning, I was up before 6. Turkey in the oven, apple pie already done, the cranberry sauce, my grandmother's recipe, cooling in a bowl on the counter. I stood at my kitchen window over the sink, the wide one, the one Tom didn't want, and watched the snow fall on the garden. The rhubarb was under there somewhere, waiting. The native plants I'd put back with my own aching hands were under there too. In spring, they would come back. They always came back. Matthew and Renee moved out on February 8th, a week ahead of schedule. I helped carry boxes to the van. I gave Renee the plant starts she'd admired from the garden the previous summer, the ones I'd overwintered on the mudroom shelf. and I told her they'd do well in a south-facing window until she had a garden of her own. She thanked me. The thank you was genuine. I believe these things can be complicated and genuine at the same time. The house was mine again. I stood in the front hallway the evening after they left, and I hung my mother's cross-stitch back where it belonged. I brought Tom's green armchair back from the corner where it had been pushed and set it in front of the window where it had always stood, where you could see the whole backyard. I put Sylvie's ceramic bowl on the hall table. I'd bought a new one, smaller than the old, the right scale for the space. I sat in Tom's chair and I looked at the backyard in the February dark. In the spring, I thought, I would plant the tomatoes where the afternoon light was right. I would let the echinacea come back on its own because it always did. I would sit on the back porch in July with Paulette, and Sylvie would drive up for long weekends, and maybe Mathieu and Renee would come for dinners once they'd found their footing in their own home, their own space. The life that was properly theirs to shape. And I would be here, in the house Tom and I built, at the table I'd had for 20 years, in the kitchen with the wide window, drinking coffee from a machine I chose myself. There is something that I want to say to anyone who recognizes any part of this story, because I spent years teaching young people about literature, and I believe that stories are only useful if they teach you something honest. Here is what I learned. Generosity is not the same as permission, and silence is not the same as consent. When we love someone, we often absorb small injuries without naming them, because naming them feels like making trouble, and we have been taught that making trouble is something to avoid. But those small injuries accumulate. They become the furniture of your life rearranged, until one day you walk through your own home and don't recognize it. You are allowed to have terms. You are allowed to say what those terms are. You are allowed to say them kindly, without cruelty, without drama, clearly and directly, and then hold to them. This is not coldness. This is not selfishness. This is the basic maintenance of self-respect, and you cannot love anyone well, truly, sustainably, honestly, if you have abandoned your own ground entirely. My mother used to say that you teach people how to treat you. I thought I understood that when she said it. I was in my 60s before I understood it in my bones. The cedar garland still hangs above my front hallway. The little brass bells still jingle every time someone walks through the door. Some things are dated in the best possible way. They are old because they have lasted, and they have lasted because they belong. I belong here too. I always did.